Hello, everybody. Welcome to Woodmere this afternoon. It's wonderful to see a packed house for an art lecture on a Saturday afternoon in the springtime. And, you know that, whoa, hey. It's so wonderful to see so many friends and to see so many artists whose work is up on the walls. And it is a very great honor and pleasure for me to say thank you to Robert Kohler and the Kohler family, who have come from far and wide to be here on this special day to celebrate the extraordinary generosity of their family in really shaping Woodmere's collection of art in very significant ways, and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts collection in very significant ways. If you don't know, this exhibition, Bodies and Souls, organized by my very dear friend Bob Cozzolino, who's going to be speaking with us, and I'll introduce Bob in a minute. But this is two shows, and I have a feeling Bob is going to say the same thing, because I see behind me the cover and the back of the catalog, which include works of art that are on view here at Woodmere and also at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. So this is a two-part thing, and so if you're here today at Woodmere, I hope you'll also go down to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. My other very dear friend here from PAFA is Judith Thomas. And Judith, why don't you raise your hand? Judith was the acting director of PAFA through the gestation of, through the process of organizing this exhibition, and it was just wonderful to work together with you, Judith. So thank you so much. I recognized Rob Kohler, who's with us today, but a person who also has to be recognized is the late Frances Kohler. And Ann Minich said, yeah, let's give it up for Frances, because something that's just so interesting about the way the Kohlers collected, Rob and Frances collected art together. It was a shared adventure and exploration. They pushed each other to, the sort of the limits of comfort zones with art, and that led them to good places. Because, if you stay where you're comfortable, sometimes you never stretch. And they stretched each other. So Frances's fingerprints are here, and we want to honor her and thank her because she is missed. I'm holding in my hands the catalog for the exhibition. I held it up before. If you are an artist whose work is in the show, please identify yourself to Brandy at our front desk, and she will give you a catalog. Everybody else, I hope you'll buy one, because it helps us, it helps the museum pay for the expenses associated with producing a book. So we're, of course, very grateful if that's something that you can do. Also, if you're an artist, I hope you'll identify yourself to my good friend Daryl Moran, who's right over here behind my back. And Daryl is a wonderful photographer. He's, I think, the best event photographer in all of Philadelphia. And what we love to do here at Woodmere is take photographs of artists in front of their works. And we have a wonderful history of artists with their paintings on the walls. And I don't know, one of these days we're going to have to do an exhibition about it or something, Daryl. But we would really love that. And in that spirit, I want to say that there are not only works of art that are gifts from the Kohlers in this gallery where we are all sitting, but in our chandelier gallery, which is what we call the gallery in the historic staircase, are a series of works by the artist John Winters, who was the primary design artist at Wanamaker's. And, this is the man who invented Christmas windows and giant Easter eggs hanging from the ceiling and the, over the eagle and all of that. And there's wonderful pieces by John Winters. There are, there's a sprinkling of contemporary art, especially by the artist Tina Newberry in our historic galleries. These are paintings that look back at history. by Tina Newberry that were also gifts from the Kohlers. And then, of course, you have to go to McGuire Hall, where, again, you can enjoy, some pretty spectacular works of art that were gifts from the Kohler family in Woodmere's collection now and are on view in McGuire Hall. So there's a lot to do here today. The main thing I want to do now is just introduce my friend Bob Cozzolino, who many of you know here in Philadelphia. Bob was a curator at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts for over a decade. 11 and a half years, but whoever counted. And Bob did some of the very great shows. Hello.
Hi, Bill.
Bob did some of the very great shows at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts that are very memorable. If you saw World War I and the Arts, and I forget what the title of the show was, but that was a memorable, spectacular, interesting, mind-opening exhibition. David Lynch. Yeah. And so many more, but Bob is a great curator, and I would say that Bob, who's, I would say one of Bob's driving passions and interests is the figurative arts and the figurative tradition of modernism. We think about modernism historically, if we were brainwashed by the Museum of Modern Art, we think of modernism as a march towards abstraction. And Bob was always a voice that said, that's maybe one story, but the figurative arts and narratives and art that expresses something about what it means to be human, using the human figure, never went away. And I think that's part of what made you such a great curator at PAFA, because, of course, it's PAFA that anchored American art in the figure and in the study of the figure and the drawing of the figure. But, so much of what you've done has to do with sort of bringing the figurative arts from the present, exploring the diversity of what it is, and moving that into the future. And I think if you look around us on the walls, you can see a lot of that happening. And I think if you go to PAFA, you can really see how this particular show, Bodies and Souls, and the way Bob shaped it and made it come to life, can really, give us a sense of how that very important institution here in Philadelphia has a very exciting direction to explore as it marches into the future. So all of it incredibly exciting. I've spoken for a long time, but there are so many people to thank. Oh, and I'm being reminded to ask you to shut your phones off, because we don't want to have phone calls or goofy, sounds in the middle of the lecture. And then I'm just going to hand the microphone over to Bob. But thank you all very much for coming today, and thank you, Bob.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing this afternoon with us. This was going to be a gallery talk, but that would have been unwieldy. I would have tried it, but now I can be more subversive. So I just wanted to start off by thanking Rob and Frances Kohler, who came into my life, I'll tell you about that in a minute, in 2006. And I was at PAFA from 2004 to 2016. Curators need advocates and allies and people who are going to collaborate with them across the ecosystem of the art world. And collectors are obviously a critical part of that. I always think of artists first, but the collectors who I have spent the most time with and gotten along with the best and really learned a lot from are the collectors who prioritize artists and put artists central to how they think about what they're doing when they are doing philanthropy and how they're supporting people in the world. And Rob and Frances Kohler made a point from the beginning of their collecting saga to support living artists. And so those artists would know there was somebody out there really dedicated to making sure that they were getting the advocacy and the representation, the presenting them in a public space too. And that is huge for artists, to know that somebody out there cares about what they're doing and is going to financially support it, but then also place it in museums and also loan it to museums so that their work can be seen in a dialogue in the public. And that's absolutely what Rob and Frances have had in the front of their minds since the very beginning, and that's what drives me as a curator, is artists first. So as Bill said, this is a collaboration between the Pennsylvania Academy and Woodmere because Rob and Frances have been so dedicated to these two institutions in Philadelphia. I learned a great deal from Rob and Frances as a curator, and I think it's not an understatement to say they really changed how I thought about what I was doing at PAFA and what my role was. And we really collaborated together, because often, they were clear about what their boundaries were, but they said, if you need help with something, if there's something that the museum isn't able to acquire or that you feel really strongly about, we'll help you. Just ask us. And if we're not into it, we will say no. And that honesty and openness was just huge for somebody starting off as a curator at a public institution. And so I know that that is the relationship that they've had with this institution as well. And what I also say is that when I left Philadelphia for Minneapolis in 2016, where I've been ever since, one of the things people asked about is, what is the Philadelphia art scene like? And my time here was characterized by lots of collaboration and seeing institutions and galleries and artists and people in the art world collaborating and mutually supporting one another. I always say that it is a cooperative and non-contentious art world where people really want to work together. And maybe part of it is like saying F you to New York and having that kind of chip on your shoulder about that. Certainly growing up in Chicago, there was a little bit of that too. We're all in this together and we don't need that place. And we're strong enough and we're going to show everybody that our culture is just important. But there's something about the ecosystem in Philadelphia that's special. So it is unusual that two institutions, instead of competing with one another, would collaborate. So I think that's also a testament to Bill's leadership as well. So Rob and Frances lived and raised their family here in Philadelphia. And Rob, I think it's important to just kind of know a little bit about their backgrounds. Rob was a history of science professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And Frances was an editor, and she was interested in editing ISIS, which was a scholarly academic journal. And also Rob wrote a lot of books about not just the science, but how people work together in the scientific community to generate knowledge and come upon discoveries. Again, that collaborative spirit, which is going to kind of come up over and over again. And if you go to PAFA to see the show, one of the things you'll see is that there's a lot of artists from different kinds of communities, whether it's Chicago or Philadelphia or the Bay Area in California, who are kind of rivals and friends. And those kinds of communities of artists, they kind of organically started to collect. So there's a lot of artists in the Kohler collection who are friends, remain friends to this day, and we're kind of feeding off of one another and challenging one another. And so I also think that in some of the work that Rob has done around science, he's interested in those kinds of communities. So I met them in 2006 when I was working at PAFA. There was a hole in the exhibition schedule in the Fisher Brooks Gallery. A show had dropped out, and I had to, actually volunteered to organize an exhibition in 4 months. And it was this show called Art in Chicago, Resisting Regionalism, Transforming Modernism. Because I noticed that there had been a number of works by Chicago artists in the basement of PAFA and the storage collections. And so I said, well, we could do a show of that. I could borrow some things from people I know in Chicago, and we could kind of fill in the gaps. And so I did it. And at that point, I didn't know Rob and Frances. And these are just two installation views of that show. And a friend of mine named John Corbett, who is one of the people who runs Corbett versus Dempsey Gallery in Chicago, called me and said, well, you're borrowing these things. We're helping you find collectors and stuff. Do you know Rob and Frances Kohler? And I said, no. And he said, you have to meet them. You're going to get along famously. And also, when you go to their house, you're going to freak. And so I went to their house and I freaked. And so this is just an image of how Rob and Frances live with their art. I mean, there's collectors who have storage off-site or kind of collect things and they disappear. They're just sort of hidden somewhere or they're boxed up. It's kind of like really accumulation rather than collecting. Rob and Frances wanted to be around these things. They wanted these artists who they were getting to know as friends, whether they really knew them well or whether they just sort of got to know them through their work and really live and integrate their lives with this stuff. So it's work that's loved, it's really in their lives. And so when I went to see the collection, actually Rob and Frances came to the show. I remember Rob said to me, wow, I didn't know there was anybody in Philadelphia who knew about this stuff or cared about it. And I grew up in Chicago, so I was still kind of like a hometown city booster, and was proselytizing about Chicago art anywhere I could go. So in a way, it was really meaningful for me to do that show, but also I had no idea that anybody in Philadelphia was collecting this kind of material. And they had really collected a lot of work by Chicago imagists and people like that. So we got to know one another, and I think one of the things that and I also saw a lot of artists in that collection that I was enamored of and had really gained a lot from spending time with their art, like Gregory Gillespie and some other figurative artists who are using representation in a figurative mode for kind of liberatory purposes and for really probing themselves, depicting the intangible and how they felt in a very, very clear way, rather than depicting just what you might see around, but really imbuing their ability to use their technical skill to represent things from the real world, but then making it sort of more intense so that as you're looking at it, you know that there's something else going on there, and it starts to swirl all sorts of associations you bring to it. So, growing up in Chicago and coming from that context and then seeing what the Kohlers had done, their collection was very much kind of not a rejection of New York, because they do have artists who were in New York, but a real personal collection of things that were really counter to what the art world said was important. They were using their own eyes and their gut, and they weren't following trends or the market. And, in a way, it's a rejection of and an acknowledgement of this way of looking at things. This is a Saul Steinberg New Yorker cover from 1976, and the title of this is The World Seen from 9th Avenue. And I think for a lot of us, we sort of think that, and have seen that New York museums and the New York art world, which often appends to itself national, is a very provincial place and often doesn't look around the world at artists in Oklahoma or Minnesota or wherever they might be to see what people are doing elsewhere around the country. And so that kind of always resonated with me. And then there's this cartoon from 1946 that Anne Reinhardt, I made all these notes and I'm not looking at them, had made in 1946, which purported kind of facetiously, he had a sense of humor, to show the family tree of modern art, and all these leaves have artists' names on them. But what I'll draw your attention to is that the limb, the thick limb that has subject matter weighing it down, is threatening to crack and may actually kill the tree. And that's funny, but the way that modern art, as Bill had sort of alluded to, was taught after the 1940s was that modernism was a progression towards ever more abstract art, and that artists really should only care about the materials of their work, not content, not subject matter, nothing like that. And so that's a simplified way of looking at things, but that's really how the history of modern art was taught. But I looked at things like this Peter Bloom painting finished in 1948 called The Rock, and Jackson Pollock's Echo from 1951 when I was in grad school, or actually in high school even, and saw similarities in form and content, and particularly in form used to generate the meaning of something. I could go on about these two, but we're going to talk about the Kohlers. But that's kind of where I was coming from when I met the Kohlers. So they were very supportive from the beginning. They lent to shows that I organized, like Narcissus in the Studio, which was a show of portraits and self-portraits at PAFA in 2010 and 2011. They lent these groups of things, plus more by Gregory Gillespie and William Beckman, portraits of one another by these friends. And you'll see at least the giant portrait of Bill Beckman by Gregory Gillespie at PAFA. And in that show, there was also a working studio that PAFA students could sign up to have space in. So people were walking around and seeing these self-portraits, but they also saw artists making self-portraits in this room. So here's just a couple more views of that. In 2012, the collector Linda Lealter decided to give her collection of art by women to the Pennsylvania Academy, and that's where it's been ever since. So we did a show. And that was a great way of really expanding the museum's community of artists, because there's so many artists in that collection that are national, and they came to the show, and they really were, it was meaningful for them to meet Lee, because many of them had heard about her, but they had never met her in person. That's her on the far left here in this photo of her with me and Diane Edison. And a lot of artists really got closer to PAFA who had never had any connection to it because of Lee. And Rob and Frances saw this. They saw what Lee had done. They saw that she was very particular about where that collection was going to go. And they also saw this community of artists really responding to that and feeling good about how that had happened. And I think that's ultimately one of the reasons why they decided to make a bequest to PAFA. So they started collecting in the early 80s after seeing two exhibitions. This exhibition of contemporary American realism since 1960 that was held at PAFA. Here's just a couple of views of that, which really presented contemporary American realism as things you can see and apprehend in front of your eye and depict exactly the way they look. Also, work from photographs. And so people who were in that exhibition who had a Philadelphia connection are Sidney Goodman. Here, that painting is now at PAFA. It's not from the Kohler collection. And then Martha Erlbacher, there with Sidney. That painting is, of course, in this room, and it was a work that the Kohlers bought. It's called In the Garden. It's from 1976. And it was Martha Erlbacher's attempt to use the body for expressive purposes to show a mood in an emotional sort of scenario. It's riffing on the idea of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the night before his crucifixion, he is, it's often referred to in the Stations of the Cross as the agony in the garden, where he's imploring God and he's asking why he should be doing this. Is it all worth it? He's having doubts, but he also comes around and he understands things. But it's a way to show that he's also human. And so, of course, there's no reference to Jesus here, but Martha Erlbacher's using these figures, and she was thinking about that as she was making this painting. And the stones were inspired by a trip to Scotland, where she saw these massive sort of standing stones and thought this is an image of despair to her, and also conveyed through the body language of the bodies, but also because of this desolate landscape, that it has a little sprig of hope in this plant that's growing here that is sort of the world teetering at the end, but it might have hope to come back. And then there's also a small self-portrait by her that's upstairs that the Kohlers also collected and gave to the Woodmere Art Museum. And it's interesting to me about this painting that Martha Erlbacher is somebody who really included a lot in her work. She showed a great deal, and she was very thorough and rigorous. But here in this self-portrait, she's hiding her eyes. She seems to be kind of retreating. She's not giving us everything. And when she was asked about this by Bill Valerio in an interview, she said, "The eyes are the window to the soul, and I don't want to reveal everything." So it's her showing herself, but also being a little protective of her own self. And in terms of Sidney, the works that the Kohlers supported of major purchases here is a painting called A Waste from 1984 to 1986 that was on view last summer in a show that Bill had invited me to curate very generously. So it was up for a long time. But instead of that, we have this painting of an electric chair. This is from very early in Sidney's career, from 1959. So it's unusual to see something like this by Sidney, because we really know him in Philadelphia for his drawings done in the 1980s, often in response to photographs of current events that he kept files on and was really inspired by, and then transformed them in his work. Always interested in the relationship of human beings to one another. What do we do to one another? How do we help? How do we care? But also, how do we do horrible things to one another? And this painting is an early example of his interest in that. It's not explicit, it's sort of more hinting at things and using a language that's a little close to surrealism. But I think as a viewer, you figure it out and you know exactly where he's coming from. At the time that he painted it, there was a lot of debate in the world. There had been a Supreme Court case about challenging the Eighth Amendment by people who wanted to abolish the death penalty. And the Eighth Amendment is, of course, it has a concession about cruel and unusual punishment. And people who wanted to abolish this practice of killing people with electric chairs as retribution for their crimes, whether they had actually committed them or not, wanted to sort of use that as a way to vote, advocate for abolition. And it didn't work at the time, and in fact, in the year that Sidney painted that painting, there were 40 executions. So Sidney noticed these kinds of things, and he was always interested in what was going on in American culture and society, and he transforms that in the kind of language he's using in the painting. So it's not as direct as like an Andy Warhol electric chair or something like that, or explicit, but he also has this kind of circus-like atmosphere around it, which I think relates to historical photographs of lynchings, where you see these white crowds who are having picnics or like merrily watching these horrible racist things. And so I think there's a nod to that, because we know Sidney looked at photography and he really paid attention to its history and how it documented things. He told Terry Gross in an interview on Fresh Air when the Contemporary American Realism show was up that he looked at images in Life magazine of the liberated concentration camps in Germany. And he also grew up in a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was really rough, and violence was always kind of a threat. And so all of that kind of permeated his consciousness and then got into the work. So I think all of that is in that early painting already. Gregory Gillespie was in that show at PAFA, and that's where I think Robin Francis first saw the work, and then he's one of the artists that they've collected in depth. The other show that they saw in the early 80s that really kind of turned their heads was actually not a show at one place, but a collaborative exhibition of 30 shows. A collaborative exhibition of 11 shows on 57th Street in Manhattan that all these coordinated galleries did simultaneously under the organization the Artist Choice Museum, which was a group of artists who didn't have a space but put on these exhibitions at different places. And so these 11 galleries put on a show called Bodies and Souls, and that, Rob Kohler writes about this in the catalog, that exhibition, as opposed to the PAFA collection or exhibition, showed realism was diverse, weird, abject, got into psychological issues. Representation could be used to be very clear, and you can identify everything, but it was almost feral. And that excited them, that artists were pushing the limits of their craft vulnerability, showing who they were, exploring who they were, and showing the messy things in the world. This painting was in that show. It's a Luis Cruz Azaceta painting called Apocalypse Now or Later from 1981. And they eventually bought it. It's at PAFA. That's Luis Cruz Azaceta riding, is it a horse? Is it a giant rat? Who knows? Heralding the apocalypse. And, at the time he was channeling the anxieties of nuclear proliferation, among other things. And so it's all in that picture. But this really excited the Kohlers because here you had work that, Frank Goodyear, who curated the exhibition at PAFA in 1981, had said, in American realism, like with Caravaggio, there's no angels, there's no supernatural things because artists, they don't see that stuff. But in this show, in these 11 shows, that's what the artists were painting. They were saying, this is just as real. I feel this. I feel this is the state of the world, and that's just as real as being able to paint that piano as though it is a real object. And so that's the sort of thread that the Kohlers really followed. So the first painting, which is a pastel that they bought, is this Jane Lund from 1974 and 75 called Party for Myself. But at first they hated it. They saw this on view at a gallery, and they were repulsed by it, and they left. And as they were driving back to Philadelphia, because I think the gallery was in Boston, they both realized that they were both thinking about it. They couldn't stop thinking about this work. It was in them, and it was calling them back. So when they got to Philadelphia, they called the gallery and they bought it. And I think that's important because you can see that they're not just thinking about these things as things that they could sort of put in their house, or these objects, or objects that are going to raise their social status. They're fascinated by, why would an artist make this painting? It's a self-portrait of Jane Lund. And then it's also Jane Lund really 4 times. It's 4 aspects of herself as she's described it. Her outgoing, gregarious self, her friendly self, the sort of pure, traditional, spiritual woman, this woman who has no, qualms and shame about just showing her body and being herself. And then, and then this person who kind of represents self-loathing. So those are just aspects of Jane, and she was interested in this idea of a split self, and how do you represent that? And again, all of these are probably from life and then transformed a bit. They're real people, they're real things, they're real experience of identity, but they're all inhabiting the same space simultaneously. So the Kohlers were really interested in how artists are dealing with themselves this way. And they wound up collecting Jane in depth. There's other works by Jane that are on view at PAFA that show her exploring her identity when she's pregnant, in other sort of guises as a priestess here, and then later in life in 2016, which is a pastel that shows her and the pastel artist from the 18th century, Jean-Etienne Lyotard, inhabiting the same space as bodies and souls. So other people that they've collected in depth, you'll see at PAFA, but also here and at PAFA, is the Philadelphia-based artist Anne Minich. Anne is somebody that the Kohlers met after Lee Alter gave their collection, because she had Anne's work in her collection. And Anne came up to me at the opening, and she said, "I know you don't know who I am, but I want you, I'm an artist." And I said, "Oh my God, I know who you are. There's a collection, there's a piece in the collection, or a couple." And she said, "I want you to come to my house and see my work. I have a lot of work in my house." So I went, and again, I lost my mind, because Anne is incredible and a virtuoso, and also is really prolific. And nobody had really paid attention to her work in ages. So I knew Rob and Frances would be fascinated and really interested right away. So they became close friends, and Rob and Frances have purchased a lot of different kinds of work by Anne, representing every phase of her career. So this piece, Nursery Rhyme, is on view here. And it is from 1992, and it's Anne using her silhouette with a shaved head, which she's used over and over again as the central motif in a series of works that's about identity and thinking about the body and about sacred altars, and it winds up being a lot of different kinds of things. Here she represents herself 4 times, so you'll have to see up in person. There's the object up there. That this looks like a drawing on paper in line that's taped on here, but it's all actually hand painted. It's a trompe l'oeil image. This shell is actually a real shell, and often collects lots of little different things from the real world and puts them into her panels and integrates them with the imagery, mirrored here, and then another image of the self. And it's called Nursery Rhyme because it was triggered by a Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem that some of you probably know, which goes, "There was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good indeed, but when she was bad, she was horrid." And people who know how mischievous Anne Minich is and her sense of humor, and where she'll go with her imagery, that's Anne Minich to a T. So this is a work that Anne made when she was at the age of 79, after she had been through a round of chemo. And she has told me that she made this altar with a drawing of herself. So it's a little like portable altarpiece. It's on view at PAFA. which looks like this when it's closed, and then this when it's open, and there's where the graphite drawing is. And she said when she was having this experience of going through chemo, she felt like she was all body, and her head kind of shrunk down, and she was having, you know, as people do, sort of cloudy thoughts and things like that. But she made this really precise, loving, almost medieval kind of altarpiece to commemorate that experience, because she's stepping forward in space, despite the fact that she's having this experience of her body and health problems, because she's actually going to come through it, and she did, and she's moving into the present, and she can share her experience with other people. That impulse to be vulnerable and show oneself in these moments and be honest about it for other people is, again, something that the Kohlers were always drawn to, and I would say that characterizes a lot of what Anne did. In here, there's a lot of connections between artists who knew one another in Philadelphia, and we could talk a lot about who were friends and who taught together and things like that. And the same can be said of Philadelphia artists and people from around the country, and those connections between those folks are really important. This is a close friend of Anne's named Juan Gonzalez, who unfortunately he died from complications from AIDS in 1993. But in the show at PAFA, you'll see her work, which is this drawing of Juan's chest, which is a small drawing. It's a virtuoso drawing, juxtaposed with this small kind of altarpiece to his identity and his early life in Cuba with family members and lovers. So Juan is shown a couple times here. His father is here, his mother is here. That's probably Juan too, I bet. Even though it's a riff on a actually Hugo van der Goes altarpiece from the Uffizi. And it's a watercolor, believe it or not, that's then set into this tabernacle that he made. And so that impulse to use sacred language and forms that come out of either a Catholic tradition or a religious tradition is something that often is used in a lot of the work that you'll see at PAFA, but also here, and these references to those kinds of things that are updated in a modern idiom or a contemporary idiom. It's another drawing that Anne did of Juan Gonzalez called Hungry Jesus from 1979 or 78 that she actually gave to the Minneapolis Institute when I was there. So they're both now represented there. And so I think, you know, looking at her friend, Juan, and trying to express different aspects of his personality, but also getting at how he could be unpredictable, but he could also be this worker who was painstaking in his art, but also sexy and, you know, a little wild, is all contained in here. There's a suite of 12 little paintings that Anne did called the Aspirational Series that's upstairs. That highlights another aspect of her work, which is that she does work in series, but also she often is pulling in literary references to the work or is referencing things that were written or things that people said to her and incorporating them. So there's a lot of text in the work sometimes. This was done in 2024, and I'm not going to go into what all of the titles are, but I just want to point out that, you know, one of them is called 124 Bluestone Road, which is the house that the familial haunting happens in Toni Morrison's Beloved. So she's reaching into different things that had an impact on her consciousness or part of her identity, and which she returns to again and again. There's also one that references City Year, so Anne's involved in that program here. And this is a reference to the skyline of Philadelphia with found objects that she's integrated in there. And every one of these paintings, or really they're assemblages, the backdrop to it is this shape here, which she refers to as span. She's done other works with this shape, but that shape, does anybody recognize that shape? It's, yes. Tabitha, did you, no, sorry. Yeah. So Marcel Duchamp's last piece that he did in secret that's at the Philadelphia Museum. You look through this door that he found in Catalonia, and you look through, and I'm not going to tell you what you see, but it's the legs of the woman in there, and her vulva. A little hint at it. So, I think that's interesting because, a lot of times, I mean, the PMA is about to do this Duchamp show with the Museum of Modern Art, but I don't know if they've really traced the impact of Duchamp on Philadelphia artists, and I would be interested to hear how having that Ahrensburg collection here has really made artists either push back at it or think about how to incorporate some of the lessons from looking at it. This is a drawing by Marcy Hermansater. Again, I just mentioned that there's a reference to a Toni Morrison book in Anne's work, as there is in this. This is a drawing from 1981 called Learning to Fly, and this was inspired by Hermansater reading Song of Solomon. And so in there, there's a motif that happens from the beginning with the protagonist about having this impulse to jump into the air and to fly. And it happens, it morphs. There's a lot of ways that she uses that device throughout the book, but for Hermansater, that really was a kind of way of thinking about imagery that could be depicting political and personal and creative freedom. And at the center, you have this book with wings sprouting out of it, and there's references to Malcolm X and other kinds of things in culture that Hermansater was making these sort of automatic connections to. Other sort of strains and ideas that happen in the work that the Kohlers acquired for Woodmere with Bill as a collaborator often have to do with social justice and racial justice, and often the experience of black artists in Philadelphia as they went out into the world, or how they digested the experiences that were happening to them and made visual art about them. So Paul Keen Jr., whose work is right here on the wall, is somebody who is well represented at both PAFA and here. And this is a work that Rob Kohler helped acquire at auction relatively recently. It's, to me, an extraordinary find. It was, I think, if not the first, one of the first paintings that Keen made after he left Philadelphia and went to Paris in 1949. He was a lieutenant as a Tuskegee Airman. He was in the 332nd Fighter Group. He fought in World War II. He went to school on the GI Bill, so he went to Tyler, but he also went to the Académie Julian. And he went to Paris, really, it was sparked by being turned down for a job at Penn State that he really felt had to do with racism. And so, like so many other black artists and writers and musicians who were experiencing those kinds of things in the United States at the time, he found an expatriate community and a community in Paris and in France that was more welcoming and a little bit more sort of collaborative. So, like Buford Delaney and James Baldwin were there around the same time. So he went there, and I think this painting, which is called Odysseus, is in a way a kind of allegory of that, of leaving Philadelphia and going out and not knowing what's going to happen when you leave here and go to this new place, and thinking about whether you're going to be on this decades journey and come back and what will have changed. So he's thinking about the story of the Odyssey. That, I don't know if that's a stand-in for him or just a sort of neutral figure that he invented in this wooden boat, surrounded by, what we perhaps will think of as the sirens in the story, who are trying to seduce to bring Odysseus to his death. And then, have reference to bridges, which could be bridges that are memories of Philadelphia or Brooklyn or something like that, which are flooding. So there's a catastrophe happening here. But we have the sense that these boatmen are going to kind of bring him safely to wherever he's going. But right there at that moment, it's dramatic, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. So it's an interesting way, I think, that Keen is thinking about his own personal experience and not making it explicitly autobiographical, but using these stories from history and from myth to relate to his own personal journey. The Kohlers collected a lot of portraits, and so it's natural that as they were working with Bill, they collected a lot of portraits for Woodmere. And so There's a number that are on view, mostly on the second floor, but some down here. I just wanted to highlight a few of them and give you a sense of who they're by and of. This is by George Biddle, and it's of an artist who is sort of towards the middle or end of his career at that point, Abraham Wolkowitz, who was an artist who probably was best known in the teens for depicting, being kind of obsessed with Isadora Duncan, the dancer. And so Biddle actually shows, it's like the two of them are in this conversation. He's listening to this elder artist, and there's images of Isadora Duncan all around him. So, you know, I think it shows an admiration of a younger artist for an older artist, painting him with a great deal of dignity and interest. And then this is a painting by an artist who was new to me when this was acquired by Woodmere. It's an artist whose last name is Harmon, and he was an artist who really was active in the Philadelphia school district. He was a teacher of high school students and really dedicated to his students and mentoring young people. And he also was really interested in the 1960s in advocating for black culture broadly and was one of the organizers of a 1969 exhibition of African American art in Philadelphia. So I think his dedication to teaching young people is completely committed or integral and connected to that kind of interest at the time of the black arts movement, the civil rights movement, all of these things coming together and being integrated for a common purpose. And so we don't know who these two people are. I know a couple people who studied with them, actually. I've met them in the last night, yesterday at PAFA, somebody came up to me and told me that. And one of Rob Kohller's sons actually took classes with him, because I think he also taught at PAFA. Both of you did? Okay. Bernard Harmon. And then this is a screen print that was made from a painting that's in a collection in San Francisco now by Alice Neal of this gay couple, Jeffrey Hendricks and his partner. And we're fortunate enough to have an oral history of them talking about what it was like to model for Alice Neal. And one of the things that Jeffrey Hendricks says, and that's Jeffrey here, is that you know, a lot of people are like, "Oh my God, you're gonna pose for Alice Neal." You know, she always does terrible things to her sitters. I mean, not physically, but in paint. You're really brave. But they found the experience intimate, and that all of their relationship really strengthened by sitting. Because Alice Neal was always excited when she knew that there was a couple. You know, she wanted to paint people because she was interested in their personalities or their faces or whatever. But when she had a couple that would agree to paint for her, sit for her, she was really thrilled. And so it seems like they had a very positive experience, and somehow it had an impact on their relationship overall, sitting there over and over again for Alice. This is a painting by Frank Galuska. There's a couple works by him, and I just wanted to show you another kind of image of a portrait that's done. You know, this looks like it's done very attentively and precisely, but one of the things that Frank Galuska talked about with a lot of his work, I don't know if he's here, I've never met him, is that he would start, and you know, he's conscious of what he's doing, but he would let his subconscious and sort of have free reign. And so I can imagine then in this picture that, you know, maybe he started with her, but then all of this might have sort of started to organically come to him. So it's not really being done from observation necessarily, but it's largely invented, and it's from different kinds of visual associations that are built into the picture. So you don't necessarily think of representation and realist painting in that way, but with Frank, he talks about that process, like allowing that kind of unconscious approach to direct what he's doing. There is a group of works that are among my favorites in this installation that are by artists who are really interested in the duality between the material world and the spiritual world and how they come together. And so there's a number of artists who are interested in, who are frank about how they communicate with spirits, with the ancestors. They have a spiritual practice that is integral to their art-making practice, and that is manifest in the work that you see on view. One of them is Twin 77. This piece, which Robin Francis helped Woodmere buy, is I don't know if it's on view in the other building because I haven't seen the other building yet, but it was on view in a show last summer for a long time. The spirits of the reincarnation of my brothers and sisters, which is a great painting. It's something that I could talk about forever. But the other painting that's on view here, which is large, and over there on the other side of the gallery, it almost begins the show, is this painting that is of Oshun worshippers. In the Yoruba religion, the Orisha Oshun is a water goddess, a goddess of fertility and bounty. And so while we don't have Twin 77's words about this picture, we have other things that he said about these depictions of ceremony and worship that are meant to be partly observed and partly felt and experienced with the spirits coming into the time. He was very frank about that. And so you have here in the upper register these worshipers who may be flesh and blood, but then in the lower register, definitely because of the outfit that this person is wearing, there's probably somebody, that's probably an Agungun ghost or a Gungun spirit, an ancestor who has come through and is communicating with the people who are at the ceremony. Of course, it's accompanied by music, which a lot of Twin 77's works have that incorporated in. He was a drummer and a dancer, as well as a visual artist. And so it is this incredible work that you can spend a lot of time looking at and finding details in that all relate to the kind of the conjuring that happens and the manifestation that happens in ceremony, and also the permeation of the veil between the spirit world and the present world, and how we can communicate and learn from that, and also get better at understanding and hearing those voices. And so that's in part what this painting is about. Now he was here, he was born in Nigeria, and he came to Philadelphia in the early 70s in part to teach at the Ile-Ife Community Center. It's African sort of diaspora-based knowledge community center that was really an epicenter of the Black arts movement because it was a place where they were teaching traditional dance, textile design, music, art, everything, as a means to help people really get in touch with their ancestry and their traditions, and to reclaim that and then think about how that can move forward with that. So Charles Searles was one of those people who was involved there with Twin 77 and really blown away by Twin 77's range of curiosity and creativity. This painting, dancer number, I can't remember if it's number 1 or number 2, but it's a dancer from 1974. It was once owned by Susan and Barclay Hendricks. Interestingly enough, is a recent addition to the collection, and I think is just a tour de force in terms of visual design and also the attempt to show movement in 2 dimensions. So Charles Searles, in 1972, on a PAFA fellowship, went to Nigeria, and in Nigeria, he was blown away by the use of multiple patterns in the same outfits and also in different parts of just daily life, that pattern and color that seemed like they would be contrasting and not go together were harmoniously put together, and that blew his mind and really impacted the way that he conceived of himself as an artist and tried to do things for the rest of his life, even in the sculptures that he did, I think. And so this is an early example of that. And I think when I was writing for the catalog, I counted how many different patterns there are, and there's more than you think. But I think that sense of dynamism, I mean, after all, the Arthur Hall dance troupe is at Ile-Ife, and a really important early choreographer in the 70s that Searles is learning from and watching, and so that is probably partly inspired by that experience. Barbara Bullock, the great Barbara Bullock, is also somebody who was there teaching, learning from Twin 77, and incorporating her own approach to these things in her work. This is a later painting from 1985. Again, it was on view before. It might be in view in the other building, and the Kohlers helped purchase this for Woodmere. It's called Remembrance, and again, you can see that kind of thinking about what she's learning from Twin 77, his approach to showing ceremony and the relationship between the spirit world and people here, present now. is also incorporated in there, as well as dance and as well as references to different kinds of traditional stories, all incorporated in there. This is a piece that's on view, I think, right there, from 2007 by Barbara, it's from a series she did after Hurricane Katrina. And so it's called Used Furniture, and she said she'd come back to the States around the time she was on a trip, and she came back and Hurricane Katrina had hit, and she was watching the images on the news and just appalled at how it seemed like while this is a natural catastrophe, it also was enabled by the neglect of people and infrastructure in New Orleans, and that the government had really failed people and were not really paying attention to them or showing them empathy in the aftermath of it. So she said, I looked at it and I thought, what country am I in? I think we can all maybe ask that question now, perpetually. But anyway, so that is a collage of cut paper and painting that she did, and over it is the silhouette of a head, which is, I think, just a beautiful, simple device to kind of show the imprint of people on place, on history, and how, despite this, there will be this sense that there's going to be a way of moving forward. And she thought of these as positive kinds of like, not really altarpieces, but positive icons to help think about how healing could happen in the wake of that. A few other examples of things in this show that are riffing on the spiritual. There's a dancer, a lizard dancer, again, a cut-shaped paper by Barbara Bullock, and a twin 7/7 drawing from the late 60s that was done in trance and is supposed to represent sort of a ghost spirit of a bird. Dara Haskins' painting is over here. I've never met her, and I don't know if she's here. I hope she is. And this is a painting called Embodied Offering I have. And just to sort of show how a younger generation is picking up and thinking about the way the body can be meaningful and also be in relation to the sense of the spiritual and ancestors. Is this Dara Haskins? Is this one of her ancestors? Is this a spirit that's helping? But what she's doing that's important is that in this, she's holding in one hand what I take to be cowrie shells, and then here seeds. So the brown seeds and the cowrie shells are sort of dancing around her in these kinds of loops, and then she's offering them into the water. So this is just part of a series that she's done where she wants to reclaim specifically the black female body to be used for positive and powerful ways of affirming how we go forward. At least that's part of what her aim is here. Didier William, who's somebody who taught at PAFA for a little while and now is at Rutgers, is represented in both exhibitions. And this is a piece that's called Dancing, Pouring, Crackling, and Mourning. And Didier has often talked about how he was born in Haiti and has been in the United States since he was a kid, but he's often drawing on tales and familial stories and folklore that are important to him and are like the foundation sort of ideas for his value system. And so in this, you have a couple of intertwined bodies here and then one coming out here. And it may be hard to see. I think this is on view in the other building. I'm not sure, but it's a wood panel that he's painted on, and some of it is stamped, but he's carved into that body, and he often does these images of eyes. And so, in part, what Didier talks about is that by putting these eyes on these bodies, integrating them with the bodies, they have this kind of apopatraic, like protective function that they're watching. They're also kind of awake, as though it's a way for spiritual knowledge to come in through the body. And so it has all these different kinds of multiple meanings. But I think he's one of those artists who's working today, who's really thinking about where the future of representational figurative painting can go. A couple more examples of this kind of thing. This is a Henry Bermudez painting. It's sort of a textile painting. It's got things attached to it that he did after a trip to Peru in 2016. It's called The Rainmaker's Dance, and it was his interpretation of learning from traditional communities in Peru about different sort of deities and spirits and ceremony and things like that are being maintained. And this is an image of this sort of creature that can bring the rain, and its stare can cause lightning, and it has all these different kind of connections with the natural world. But I think he picked up on textile design and things he was seeing there and integrated them also with what is Henry's sort of characteristic show of organic growth and form at the bottom. And then all of the background is really a series of dots over and over and over again. So it really, when you stand in front of it, is kind of electric. I'm conscious of our time. I want to make sure you all have a good chance to stare at the actual things. But I wanted to just show you a few more ways that people who are represented in this collection sort of manifest sacred things. So this is a drawing by Roland Ayers, who's very well represented here because of partly Robin Francis's dedication to helping build up this collection after his widow, who's part of the Woodmere family, drew attention to it. And I think there's like 13 things by Roland on view here. This is a drawing that's actually on view at PAFA. It's called Orgasm from 1969. And I think it's just another way that there's a thread in the collection that you'll see, especially when you go to PAFA, of artists being unabashedly interested in sensuality and sexuality and showing that as an integral part of human experience. And when Roland Ayers does this, he takes on this content, it often does feel like he's making sort of a prayer that's about it, or it's integrated into his spirituality. This is an unusual piece because the Kohlers didn't really collect a lot of 3D work, but this is called Low Country Special from 2021 by Caitlin McCormick. And she was generous enough to tell me, what this piece means to her, and it's actually on the label, so I'll let you read about that. But one of the things that she was thinking about is during COVID, there was this resurgence of interest that people who are making artwork had because of all the loss and the mourning and the thinking about mortality in memento mori, making still lives, making images of skulls, thinking about what it means to pass on, thinking about what it means to lose loved ones. And this is one of her interpretations of that kind of idea. But it's done in fiber, so this is sort of a fiber sculpture construction, which is, for what she's doing, is a tour de force, I think. This is a work by Joan Curran, who is, very technically proficient artist who does a lot of pattern paintings, but this is a still life painting of a fish that's upstairs with a paired painting by her. Judith Schechter, whose light box is over there. This is called Sweets Kissed to Death, and she told me that this is her interpretation of, this is her words, a women's complicated relationship to food. But one of the things that, so on this woman's body are all these kisses. That's what the red marks are. But one of the things that Judith also talks about is she's using an extraordinarily important traditional method, which goes back to the Middle Ages, of doing stained glass. She's mastered that technique, but she's interested in exploring sort of social mores, relationships to the body, and she often talks about, like another artist, Tabitha Vevers, who's represented at PAFA, making something that is so beautiful and exquisitely crafted that the viewer can't help but look at it, but then when you look at it, you see that there's sort of more complex, darker, sometimes upsetting content, and it's a way of making you confront that, almost like giving you a sugar pill, I guess. Another work by Henry, and I'm just going to move forward a little bit because I'm sort of over time, but one of my favorite series that's entered Woodmere's collection recently, and again through the generosity of Robin Francis, is this suite of paintings by Walter Edmonds. And I was blown away. I lived in Philadelphia for 13 years, but I have never visited this church. I really would like to. This is a church that's at 18th and Diamond. It is the Church of the Advocate that has a long history of of integrating the spiritual practices and social justice and equality for women. It was on the forefront of this because of a charismatic leader named Father Paul Watson, who's depicted in a mural that the Mural Arts group here commissioned. I think Theodore Harris and Walter Edmonds worked on it with other people. And that's not on the side of the church, that's somewhere else in Philadelphia. But the paintings that Walter Edmonds and Richard Watson did for this church are incredible because they are so forthright in their rejection of racism. They're these anti-racist murals that these are the studies for. So in the church, there are scaled up huge examples of this, which is just such a bold and important and moving thing to do, to integrate your faith and to really show the reality of things and how it can be overcome. So finally, I want to just end on this note. There's a lot of work in this collection that I think is about connections and about how we relate to one another, whether it's Andrew Turner's trumpeter, and there's a trumpet player, but also the saxophone player, this Raphael painting of people playing music together, Jessie Drubear's frolicking women in this pool, and there's I think one of the things that I've been really moved by is that, I lived in Philadelphia for a little over a decade. It's not my hometown, but I always feel like when I'm here, it feels that way because of how many friends and connections I made here. And that, PAFA and Woodmere have invited me back to work on this meaningful project because I knew Francis and Rob so well. I really wanted to do well by them and make them proud of how their collection was going to be seen outside of their house. And so those connections are super important. And the more that I grow and get older, the way we sort of interact with one another in communities, which may be a simple thing, really shows me what change can be in the world. I start the panel here and at PAFA off with quotes by artists. So here the quote is by Frank Galushka, whose painting you see here. And the quote is, "There has always been a social conscience that's been part of the Philadelphia art world and the city, and the idea of a utopian community is part of the foundations of this city." And the quote by Luis Cruz Azaceta at PAFA goes like this: "My concern is with humanity. I want to confront the viewer with life and with what we are doing to each other. I hope to awaken in the viewer a sense of compassion. Without compassion, there is nothing." So I want to just say, right now, we can think about who we know and who we live with on our streets, who we go to work with, who we socialize with, who we pay attention to, what we let get in. And we can think about then what kinds of impacts we have when we react to those people. There's lots of ways we can be in the world. Having lived through the occupation, the federal military occupation of Minnesota, of Minneapolis, over the last few months, I can say that the most important thing is to know your neighbors and to stand up for them and to show that people who are not treating others with empathy really are not worth your time. But on the other hand, you need to try to get them to understand why taking a young man who is not even the person they were looking for outside of their house in just his boxer shorts and his robe on a below zero day is wrong. Or why tear gassing and killing people on the streets who are just trying to stand up for their neighbors is wrong. And so in Minnesota, I hope the rest of the community and the nation watched what happened when ordinary people said, no, you can't do this to our neighbors. It was really moving to be part of that and to watch it happen and to see things change. But we still have to kind of do this over and over again. These are just scenes from when all this was going on and the aftermath of it. But one of the things that was most exciting to me is that a lot of the protest happened through joy. So there's a group called Singing Resistance that my wife is part of, who were singing in front of the hotel that ICE was staying at about how they could change their minds. They don't have to do this. They can come join them. And we're doing this all around the community. There were drummers who lined up on the Stone Arch Bridge and raised money by drumming as a protest. The sex shop, Smitten Kitten, was a major place for mutual aid in the generation of goods that were being brought to people who were afraid to lose their home, to leave their homes. And many, many artists did grassroots printmaking and handed out posters for free in order to put up around the city. So that happened, and it can happen elsewhere. And if we don't like what's going on, I think we know that we have the power to use our voice. I think a lot of the artists who are represented here, Walter Edmonds, for instance, and lots of other people who are on view here in EPAFA, that's one of the threads. So this kind of idea of connections and humanity, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be in a body? And how do we relate to one another? That's one of the major through lines of the art that Rob and Francis collected. And that it's going to stay in Philadelphia, I think, is really meaningful. So thank you.